What's up everyone? If you're new here, my name is Miles and this is the Make with Miles channel. In my last video, I showed how I made this Japanese Kumiko grid work, and today we're gonna be turning that into a super rad guitar amp. Let's go. I started this build by ripping down a sheet of plywood with my circular saw. I then set the blade height of the table saw to about halfway through the plywood, and I started cutting a dado which would act as a slot for the front Kumiko grill. For this build, I really wanted to expand on my previous but limited experience of kerf bending plywood. After marking out the places where the corners should be, I began cutting the kerfs. It really depends on what wood you're going to be using, but for this plywood I set my depth of cut to about halfway through the last layer of the plywood. After cutting many tests on small scraps of plywood, I found that 8 cuts per corner was the perfect amount to achieve my desired radius. If you're going to be doing a project with kerf cutting, I would definitely recommend doing a lot of tests beforehand so that you don't ruin the piece of wood that you're actually going to be using. After cutting all of the kerfs, I laid out my plywood and marked the proper length on the end so that when it was all folded up, the 2 bottom halves would be the correct length. It was now time to disassemble my old amp to harvest the electronics. This is the amp I've been using for a while now with my pattern plywood guitar, and it's seen some wear and tear, so I felt like it would be the perfect opportunity to reuse some of its parts. This is by no means a nice amplifier, but it did the job and I liked how it sounded before, so that's what matters. For this build, I'm actually going to be upgrading to a larger and higher end speaker, so it should sound better when everything's said and done. Once I had removed the electronics box, I could test fit it in the carcass of the new cabinet. That allowed me to take some measurements so I could start cutting out a plywood piece to attach the speaker to. After rounding the corners, I drew and cut a circle that's the right size for the speaker that I'm going to be using. Next, I painted the front and interior edges of the piece so that the light color of the plywood wouldn't show through the black grill cloth that I'm going to be using. Speaking of grill cloth, I decided to try out some black plastic gardening mesh, which I already had. At first I was a bit skeptical that this would look good, but I thought I might as well give it a go. I then screwed on 2 narrow pieces of plywood to either side, which would later allow me to screw this into the main cabinet. It was now time to address the main feature of the amp, the Kumiko grill. If you haven't watched my latest video where I show you how to make the Kumiko panel, I would definitely go do so if you want to see how it was done. There's a link in the description as well as a card at the top right of this video. In my previous video, I left all the edges of the Kumiko uncut, so now it's time to mark and cut the right dimensions for the grill. This is the point in the build where everything kind of went wrong because I made a very foolish mistake. I had the outer case clamped up to do a test fit of the Kumiko panel, and the clamp at the top came loose, resulting in the whole thing unfolding and then breaking right at the kerf cuts. So I ended up having to completely remake the outer plywood box. I also had to remake the grill plate because the old one didn't fit the new box that I made. I thought it would be valuable to show what went wrong, because not every project ends up going to plan. Now that we're back on track, let's get back to the build. At this point, the Kumiko was properly fitted and it was time to start putting everything together. The first thing I did was use my pocket hole jig to drill out holes on either side of the grill plate. Next, I unfolded the outer plywood case and sprayed the kerfs with warm water. The kerf joints had become used to their folded position and did not want to bend back easily, so this just helped me unfold it more without the risk of it cracking. I then spread wood glue between each kerf cut as best as I could, and I folded it back up with the Kumiko grill slotted in the dado. Next, I screwed in the grill plate and added a reinforcing piece of plywood right over the seam on the bottom. After the glue was dry, I ran both sides of the case through the table saw to make sure that it was completely smooth where the two sides joined at the bottom. The time had come to make this case look the way I wanted it from the beginning. For my early sketches of this project, I knew that I wanted the box to be walnut, but after doing some kerf cutting tests on walnut plywood, they just kept cracking, and it quickly became clear that I had to find some alternative solution. I decided that I would make the case out of regular plywood, and then veneer it myself with some sticky back walnut veneer. After trimming the first piece of veneer flush, I just repeated the process on the back, inside edge, as well as the outer faces of the box. I'm super happy with how this turned out. The veneer also conceals some of the lines created by the geometry of the kerf cuts, and it just makes the overall appearance of each corner a lot smoother. Now that all the faces had been veneered, it was time to add some thin walnut edge banding to conceal the plywood edges. I cut some solid walnut into 1/8 inch thick strips, which will allow me to give the edges a slight round over. I used the combination of some wood glue as well as some Starbond CA glue, which acted as a clamp. This process was super easy, but it was also really satisfying seeing everything come together. After flush trimming the edges and after a good amount of sanding, it was time to apply the finish. For this project, I wanted to use something protective but also not too glossy, so I went with a wipe-on poly. Now that the main cabinet was done, it was time to work on some of the details. First up was making a nicer looking control panel. I started by cutting out a metal substrate. I designed the entire control panel with new graphics in Adobe Illustrator using a reference photo that I'd taken of the old control panel. I printed this off so that I could use it as a template to mark where the holes needed to be drilled. After I was done cutting the holes, it was time to get screen printing. Off camera, I exposed some screens with the same graphics that I designed in Illustrator. If you want a more in-depth process for screen printing, I have a full video, there's a link in the description. I used black ink to screen print the graphics on a piece of maple veneer, which I made sure to sand smooth. This took a couple of attempts to get one that I liked, but I'm super stoked with the way they turned out. Next, I added a protective coat of some clear spray finish. To attach the veneer to the metal substrate, I ended up using weldwood contact adhesive. For this, I just coated both surfaces and let them dry until they were tacky. Then I lined both of them up using the knobs on the electronics box for alignment. After they were stuck together, I used my J roller to get the best adhesion as I could. This is the point in the build where I was getting super excited because everything was coming together. After inserting the new control panel into the dado, I installed some rubber feet on the bottom of the amp. Next thing was attaching the electronics box and adding some hardware to the front knobs. It was finally time to add the upgraded speaker. This is a Weber 10-inch 30-watt speaker. To give some perspective, I think that the old speaker was only around 15 watts, but the amp itself is rated for 36 watts, so we should be good. Next up was adding the two maple back panels, which I made off camera. I'm leaving the back of the amp open because from my research, open back amps project the sound not only forward, but also backward, filling the room more and providing a more natural and ambient sound. If I had completely closed off the back, it would project forward more, creating a punchier sound. The last thing that I wanted to do was turn some knobs that would match the amp better. For this, I just turned down a laminated piece of walnut with a maple veneer stripe down the middle. After giving the knobs a coat of wipe-on poly, this build was complete. Overall, I couldn't be more stoked on how this project turned out. Despite there being a fair number of challenges and setbacks, I think it was definitely worth it. I'm also super pleased with how the amp sounds, and I definitely think it's a step up from the original amplifier cabinet. I think this can be attributed to the larger cabinet and the larger and nicer speaker. If you want to see what I make for my next project, I invite you to hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon so you don't miss my next video. And if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.